So today we're going to delve a little bit more deeply into the realm of symbolic representation, and I'll tell you what I think I'm doing, and then I'll show you a bunch of examples of it. Then I want to tell you a couple more stories, and so I'll tell you the stories in the second half of the class. So, you know, it was Carl Jung who popularized and differentiated the idea of archetypes. They weren't his idea. Platonic forms are archetypes, essentially. Ideals are an archetype, and so, but Jung, the thing that I think he did that hadn't been done before was to suggest that, as well as suggesting, as Freud did, that human beings are composed of sub-personalities. Jung pointed out, as Freud did to some degree, that some of those personalities have a universal character, and so that they can be thought about as transcendent entities. And you could think about those, well, they have been thought about and even put forward as gods of one form or another. Now, when Jung talked about archetypes, it was never clear what he meant, and I think the reason for that was because the archetype is a very complicated idea and a very complicated phenomena, and you can think about it biologically, and you can think about it socially, and you can think about it as something that the individual participates in creating. So it's not that easy to localize it. And as well, it's not that easy to localize it. And as well, Jung was never clear about what the universe of archetypes looked like. At some times he spoke as if they were a relatively small number, and then at other times he spoke as if they were innumerable. And I think the reason for that is, in part, it depends on the level of analysis, right? The more transcendent the archetype, the fewer they are, but they differentiate, because you might say, well, how many hero archetypes are there? And one answer could be one, but they differentiate all the way out into the diverse range of works of fiction that we have. So you could say there's as many variants of the hero archetype, roughly speaking, as there are works of fiction. So you think about it as a hierarchy with the ultimate archetype at the top. So then another question might be, what does the landscape of ultimate archetypes look like? And I think that that's what I tried to lay out, and that's what I'm trying to lay out in this diagram. So now, why do you want to know that? There's a practical reason, there's a number of practical reasons as well as intellectual reasons. One of the most relevant practical reasons, as far as I'm concerned, is that integrating narratives, and so those would include political narratives, integrating narratives have their force because they draw on universal archetypes. Otherwise they wouldn't have any power, right? Because they're basically stories, an integrating archetype, like the story that Hitler sold the Germans, or that the Germans and Hitler co-created, which is a much more accurate way of thinking about it. That had motive force because it had an archetypal essence, and so political stories derive their power from the underlying archetypal representations. Obviously, because they have to be concerned with the things that people find important, right? How can you sell a political message to someone if it isn't about something they find important? And if it's important to them, it's going to be grounded, at least to some degree, in their biological substructure. I mean, if you're talking to hungry people about food, it's a story that you can tell, right? Because it hooks them deeply. It hooks deep into their motivational systems. To use a narrative of utopia, which is the land of milk and honey, roughly speaking, a very, very old idea, you're also tapping deeply into intrinsic human longings. And so the idea that political narratives incorporate archetypal themes is not really, it's not an idea that I would consider particularly controversial. Putting it that way might be. Okay, so the problem with political narratives, in my estimation, is that they can rapidly transform themselves into ideologies, and ideologies are dangerous for a variety of reasons, but the primary reason for their danger, I think, this is a hypothesis, is because of their one-sided nature. What happens is that they capitalize, parasitize, I think is even a better way of thinking about it, a profound underlying narrative, but they don't tell the entire story. And so then if you're looking for orientation in the world because you're fragmented and chaotic, and somebody provides you with a partial story, that's going to serve an integrating function. And it's one of the things you see in psychotherapy is that if you're chaotic and confused and you go see a therapist who has a particular kind of practice, Freudian, behavioral, cognitive, Rogerian, whatever, there's a high probability that undergoing that course of therapy is going to be good for you, and that you might even come to view your life in the terms of that therapeutic practice. And you might say, well, why is that therapeutic practice right for you? Maybe it could have been Rogerian instead of Freudian, say. And the answer to that is, yeah, well, it probably could have been, because roughly speaking, any coherent ordering principle is better than none. And so that's also a good way to think about human development from an intellectual perspective, is that partly what has to be provided to individuals as they mature into adults is some kind of ordering structure. And this is one of the facts that people who criticize the dogmatic element of religious belief don't really understand. They don't understand that you have to provide people with a determinate structure of some type, even if it's constricting and restricting and crushing for that matter. You have to pass through a disciplinary structure before, and even in principle, you could be free. Before you're disciplined, you're not free, you're just chaotic. And so you have to practice some set of routines and rituals. Now, you could say, well, they don't necessarily have to be religious, and they could be secular. You could become a lawyer, you could become a plumber, you could become a carpenter, and I would say, yes, that's far better than not becoming anything. But the problem with an identity that isn't rooted into the archetypes is it leaves you incomplete, because the archetypal rooting of the identity is what helps you grapple with the fundamental existential problems of life. And whether you're a carpenter or a plumber or a lawyer, your soul is still going to hunger for some deeper form of identity, and you're not going to get that without having your practical identity encapsulated in something that's greater from a philosophical perspective, and perhaps even deeper than philosophy, which I think the archetypal stories are. They're the structure within which philosophy itself is embedded, and outside of that is a behavioral structure. We've talked about how those evolve. You know, there's a behavioral evolution of something approximating a consensual morality, and then stories about that consensual morality emerge, and then inside that the structures of philosophy nest, and all of those things have to be addressed by your identity to some degree, or you're weak. That's the problem. You're beset by doubts, you're beset by anxiety, you're easy to stop, and you don't have much motivation, and none of that's good. It's not good at all, because life presents you with enough real obstacles in the face of genuine suffering, so that unless you're strongly grounded and have a real reason for moving forward, you're going to get stopped. And as soon as you're stopped, you are one miserable thing, because it's almost like the definition of human misery is to be paralyzed by anxiety and emotional pain, and also have no motive force forward. It's a terrible state, and so you don't want to be in that state, and you have to have an identity that's powerful enough and deeply rooted enough so the most profound doubts that might emerge about your life are met by something of equivalent force. Okay, so we're going to review the symbolic domain and briefly, and then I'm going to show you a bunch of different examples of how it plays itself out, partly archetypally and symbolically, but also partly politically, because I want to show you how both of those things parallel one another. And partly what I'm hoping is that understanding the full domain of archetypal symbolic representation will also inoculate you against ideological possession, because you'll know when you're told a half-sided, one-sided ideological story, you'll know that there's something missing in the story. There's pieces that aren't being told, or there's part of the story that isn't being revealed. So if it's a story about how tyrannical modern culture is and how oppressive, you think, well, yes, obviously, but what about the beneficial aspect of it, and how is that being represented and dealt with? And it's the same story about the negative element of the human being, which you hear stories like that all the time, because I think perhaps more intensely since the 1960s, but because I wasn't around before then, I don't know what it was like previous to that. There is this idea that people hold, and that's promoted, that there's something fundamentally, cancerous about human beings. It was the Club of Rome, I think, when they pronounced that everyone on the planet was going to die of starvation by the year 2000, that human beings were no better than a cancer on the planet. It's like, well, yeah, there's lots of things about us that could be improved, but when you portray the human only as negative, the question should arise, it's like, fair enough, but what about the positive part? Why aren't you telling that story? And it doesn't take you, you know, all you have to do is be sick once and go to a hospital where you get competent care to understand that, you know, and you can get incompetent care too, but sometimes you get really competent care. You think, yes, it's really good that there's some people out there who have their act together and are trying to put things together. You know, and you can't forget that in your story, and you don't want to forget that in your story about yourself either. So what is the fundamental landscape? Well, the basic idea is that it's predicated, you can look at it multiple different ways. It's predicated on the contrast between explored and unexplored territory, or the contrast between the interpretive structure that philosophers like Kant talked about and the real world manifestation that whose existence underlies the validity of empirical thinking, right? There's you and your structure, you interpret the world, but there's also the world informing you. And so that's the explored territory versus unexplored territory, something like that, or it's order versus chaos, or it's another variant of that would be it's the hero going out into the unknown to encounter the dragon of chaos and to gather the information that's out there in the unknown. And I tried to make the case to you, because I'm often accused, most recently on Sam Harris's podcast, of making up post hoc stories. You know, you have a set of stories, you can interpret them any way you want. Of course, that is a danger, because you bring an interpretive structure to bear on every set of facts. How do I know that this isn't just an arbitrary post hoc analysis? And my answer to that, it's a technical answer, is it manifests itself at multiple layers of analysis simultaneously. And the probability that it's merely an imposition of an a priori interpretive structure is decreased by the number of different levels of manifestation that you can detect the phenomena. It's axiomatic. That's why you have 5 senses. That's why, because they each report a different level. That's why in science you use multiple methods to detect the same thing. So one of the things I tried to point out is that you can map this archetypal structure onto brain structure quite nicely, even onto hemispheric structure and the function of the subcortical systems, but even more particularly you can map it onto the function of specific neuropsychological systems within the biological neurology. We do have an interpretive structure, right? That's your map, so to speak, of expectation and desire in the world. That's your model. There's a brain area, roughly the hippocampus, although this is an oversimplification. It compares that with incoming sense data, which is also a model, but we won't get into that for the sake of argument. So that's explored territory. Unexplored territory, and the thing in the center doing the comparison, that's the knower. And so it strikes me as highly unlikely, although you're welcome to criticize away, that you'll see that kind of stacking of evidence across multiple domains of inquiry without there actually being a pattern there. So it's not merely post hoc analysis. And even the people who derived these patterns, like Jung to begin with, let's say, looked cross-culturally at least to say, well, here's a manifestation of a pattern, and here's a separate culture, and you can see the same pattern. So there's some attempt there to be methodologically rigorous. He did the same thing with people's fantasies and dreams, and then again, by mapping those onto people's behavior in therapy, also had them test out the ideas in the world. So these aren't as trivial methodologically as people make them out to be, and especially that's the case when you can put a biological underpinning underneath them. So the proposition is explored territory, unexplored territory, and the explorer, roughly speaking. And then a differentiation of those two things into positive and negative. Why? Because everything complex has a positive and negative element. And so explored territory can become stultifying and crushing. That's tyranny. But it also provides the structure that informs and protects you. And unexplored territory, well, that can kill you, obviously. But it's also the place that you need to go when you're static and dead, and you need new water, and you need new life, and you need new information. So it's a constant movement out into the unknown and back, and out into the unknown and back. And that's what human beings are like, right? We're information foragers. And then the individual is both positive and negative, and you know that because you know yourself and you know other people, and you know yourself. You can be, there's parts of you that are good classically speaking, or good even by your own definition, and other parts that really could use, to say the minimum, a tremendous amount of work. And you also know that about other people, and if you get truly unlucky